Skipper! Hey! Welcome back. And today I'm out on Little Norman, my classic 350. Who would have thought, with all the bikes I've owned over the decades, that the most rewarding riding experience would come from a 20 brake horsepower single cylinder 1950s tribute act bike made in India. Who would have thought? That's today's question. Who would have thought? Now my old man, my dad, he was stationed in India during the Second World War. He was an RAF engineer, and yeah, the Far East conflict of the Second World War, fighting the Japanese Imperial Army. And if you'd have said to him back then that his son-to-be would be getting a riding pleasure out of an Indian-made motorcycle here in beautiful England, he'd have thought you were mad. But here we are nonetheless. Who would have thought? And on that point, who indeed would have thought that when my old man were getting bombed and shot at by the Japs, that in not too many years further down the line, over a relatively short arc of history, bearing in mind he was a motorcyclist, that motorcycles made in that vile enemy, as it then was, state of Japan, would steal a march upon and come to dominate the motorcycle market in the UK. Who would have thought? He certainly would never have thought. It was a bit of an interesting character, my old man, you know. In as much as, and understandably, when he came back from, when he were demobbed and he came back from the Far East and got back into the somewhat more ordered pace of civilian life, and he got a job. In fact, he started working for Hoover as an engineer for Hoover. Hey, so from Spitfires to washing machines and vacuum cleaners. Talk about transferable skills, eh? And then after working for Hoover for 25 years, then he went to work for an electrical retailer called Valen Davidson. Who remembers Valen Davidson? And they used to sell electrical goods, but primarily rent out electrical goods, particularly televisions, because back in them days, 60s and 70s, you didn't buy a TV unless you were proper posh, you rented one. Who remembers that? Aye. And yeah, he was a bit of a funny character, because obviously, as you know, I came along, and as I was growing up in the 70s, and he was waxing lyrical to me with pearls of wisdom usually after he came back from the pub. Hey, he would assure me that having spent 5 years of his life fighting the quote-unquote bloody nips, he wasn't going to have anything Japanese in the house or within his portfolio of ownership, come what may, ever. But the thing was, my dad, he were a keen photographer as well as a keen cyclist and motorcyclist, and combined the two to great success, I might add. But not only that, he was a big audiophile. He loved jazz, and he loved quality audio equipment, and most of which he managed to beg, steal, borrow, make do and mend from bits and bats that were floating about during his period of work as an engineer working for an electrical retailer. Aye. So yeah, so he worked for Valen Davidson, not in the retail stores, but obviously in their engineering centre, which was, for anybody that's local to these parts, on Hen Connor Lane, Stanningley, Leeds. And I have vivid memories of him turfing me out of bed in the morning and then shuffling off to catch the bus, and then coming back home at tea time via the Junction Inn. Oh, where's my tea? If it's ready I don't want it, and if it isn't ready, where the hell is it? Hey, them what days. Anyway, I'll say what his attitudes did mellow as we got into 70s, and I think a degree of pragmatism took over from his rather understandably emotive position when it came to anything made by them bloody Japanese. And of course, back during the Second World War, the Japanese were brutal, and I'm speaking about the Japanese army, the Japanese Imperial Army. You know, the way that they treated their POWs, absolutely brutal. And in fact, not long before that, of course, they tried to take over China. Imagine that. If Japan had conquered China, how different things might be, or maybe not. Anyway, they didn't. Who would have thought? And yeah, so my dad in the 70s, you know, one minute he'd be saying, usually when he'd come back from pub, I'm not buying out from Jap, those murdering bastards, cruel bastards, that lot, 5 years of my life fighting for them, no way I'd have anything made by them, they're brutal, they never change. And then I think when it suddenly dawned on him that the only good sort of reasonably affordable hi-fi equipment, audio equipment, were all coming from Japan, and for that matter so were the motorbikes. He rode a British bike, my dad. He rode a James. When I remember him riding his motor, I'm sure he had quite a few motorcycles prior to that, but it's within my recollection that he had a 200cc James, a motorcycle, the one that he crashed the day I was born because he'd been in pub celebrating. It were a different world back then, let me tell you. Anyway, that's another tale. So he came to sort of suddenly realise and adopt a somewhat more pragmatic view in his moments of sobriety, of which there were plenty. He wasn't a pisshead, don't get me wrong. He was just the typical Yorkshireman. And so and he used to say, oh, you know, lad, best audio equipment going, and it costs a fortune, only rich folk could afford it, and it's made by a company called Nakamichi, which is about as Japanese as you can get. Now, I don't know if you know anything about anything, about audio equipment. You don't need me to tell you about the legendary status of the name Nakamichi. Absolute cutting edge. Still is, I think. Very lusted after all. I had this Nakamichi turntable, Nakamichi amplifier, Nakamichi tape deck, yada yada yada. But there were no way in hell they were ever going to be able to afford it. But I think in his line of work, somebody offered him up an amplifier because he was desperate for a right good quality amplifier for this system that he'd built. And yeah, the only thing he couldn't put his many skills to were actually building a good quality amplifier. But obviously somebody pitched up and offered him this here refurbished, I think it were a Hitachi amplifier. And lo and behold, he came home one day from work via the Junction pub, carrying this here thing about the size of 2 breeze blocks. Hey, or cinder blocks for my American friends. And weighed a ton. And also a pair of earphones, biggest earphones you've ever seen, like 2 dustbins. You put them on your head, you look like a Cyberman out of Doctor Who. These, and the make of them were Dynatron. So he come home with this Hitachi amplifier and these massive Dynatron earphones. But by God, when you plugged it all together and you put a record on and listened to it, it was just an experience I'd never encountered before, ever. And I wouldn't stand comparison with modern hi-fi equipment, but by heck, it were mind-blowing. And then he sort of started to forget his Japanese prejudices. And I'm coming to the point, this is all the lead up to a more general point. Aye. So yeah, he started to soften up on that, and of course his other great passion was photography. But of course the best cameras then back in 60s and 70s were either German or Japanese. Hey! So he bought a German camera. He wasn't going to have a Japanese camera, but he still lusted after cameras. Like, I mean, I have an old 1960s mint Nikon SLR. He lusted after cameras like that. Oh, and Hasselblads, which is Swedish made, of course. But he bought German. And if you pointed out to him, well, we were fighting Germans at the same time as we were fighting Japs, you know, he said, well, I want bloody fighting them, lad, what I saw. Fair enough. That was his justification for having a German-made camera, a Zeiss Icon. Aye. So, yeah, so it mellowed over years. I think the trauma of 1940 to 45 sort of slowly soaked away into the distance. And as a family we got bits and bats of electrical gear made by people like JVC and Panasonic and what have you. And but our television, our first good television, and the only reason we were able to afford to rent this television was because my dad worked for Valence's, were a Tandberg, and they were the last word. Swedish. Yeah, your 2 top tellies back then were Tandberg and Bang & Olufsen. But yeah, we had a Tandberg colour television, and picture quality back then, it was just mind-blowing. Aye. So yeah, one or 2 Japanese-made things started to creep into life, but not bikes and not cars, because we never had a car. Aye. So and it brings me on to a more general point, which is, if my old man can put behind him 5 years of absolute horrific trauma, being ripped out of normal life, dragged over to the far side of the world, and getting bombed and shot at every 2 minutes, if he can sort of eventually put that behind him, later rest his prejudices and start being pragmatic about the fact that if he didn't buy his Japanese audio equipment, he were never going to get good quality equipment made by anybody else, because he simply could not and never would be able to afford it. And there's a fine principle, really. Now look at them colours, eh? All dandelions then. Aye. I suppose you call it the wisdom of age, don't you? And he sort of thought, right, well, I can't do aught about what happened back then during World War II, and bugger it. I want to enjoy my quality hi-fi. I want to listen to me jazz of an evening, and I want good quality gear. And the only good quality gear that anybody amongst the working classes could ever afford was Japanese back then. And likewise, back in the 70s, I sort of became absorbed in his interest in photography. He had his own darkroom and what have you. He used to develop his own black and white films, print some cracking images of his tours around the Yorkshire Dales. But I got absorbed into it as well. And when I were about, I suppose about 10, 11 year old, I wanted my first good camera. I'd had like little Instamatics and Brownies and what have you. So my dad were right good friends with the fella that worked in the photography department at Rimington's Chemist in Bradford. A lovely fella, almost certainly not with us anymore. Terry Mason, what a lovely fella he was. Really knew his onions. And my dad managed to get me, for the princely sum of 15 quid, a good quality rangefinder 35mm camera with interchangeable lenses and a built-in light meter. Oh, a built-in selenium light meter. And he bought me it for Christmas. That'd be about 1974, something like that, 3-4. Oh, and I absolutely loved that camera. But those cameras, it were called a FED, F-E-D, FED, a FED 4L. I remember it like it were yesterday. And that camera and sort of other cameras, like there were a camera called a Zorki, a camera called a Kiev, and there were the SLR cameras called Zenith, and they were all made in the Soviet Union, as it was back then. The Soviet Union. And bearing in mind, back in the 60s and 70s, we're forever getting public information films on the TV warning us that said Soviet Union might drop the odd thermonuclear device on us and bloody evaporate us in a split second. So that was the ongoing relationship with the Soviet Union back then. But if you wanted nice quality cameras at affordable prices, and I did, and my dad wanted me to have them, that was your option. You had to buy Russian-made cameras. So yeah, so Feds, Kievs, Zorkis, Zeniths, and I had a couple of Zeniths, SLRs later on. There were a couple of Chinese makes even back then. I seem to remember an SLR called the Seagull. So you could buy Chinese, but pretty much it were all Russian stuff. I say Russian, Soviet Union. Now, so it would either put your principles to one side, because the Soviet Union were the devil incarnate. If you could put those sort of principles to one side, you could have your affordable quality cameras. but there's absolutely no way on bloody earth that we could afford anything made in Germany or Japan. Not a chance. And you know, it was the same thing with cars back then in the 70s. I remember a lot of people who were, shall we say, well, better off than us, obviously, because they had a car full stop, but call them slightly working class plus, or working class plus plus, if you like. They could afford a car of sorts, but they couldn't afford a British car or a German car or even a French car, but they could afford a Russian car, or they could afford a car made in the Soviet bloc. And of course there were Ladas and Moskviches and Wartburgs and the original Skodas and Yugos and all of them. I don't know if you remember any of them. They were all made in the Soviet bloc. Some made in Russia itself, and others made in the Warsaw Pact countries back then, in the days of the Soviet Empire. And it was dead simple, you know. Put your moral position into one side if you want a car, because there's no way you're going to be able to afford new or second hand a Ford or a Vauxhall, or certainly not a Mercedes or a BMW or a Volkswagen or an Audi. Not a chance. Not even a British Leyland car. Not a chance at all, unless you were sort of middle class and above. So yeah, make do and mend, either a new or second hand Lada or Moskvich, Wartburg. NSU were a make as well, wasn't it? Yeah, early Skodas before VW bought them out and they became a lot more premium. That's what you had to do, and that's what people did. So you can see where this is all going, can't you? This little Chautauqua. When it comes to buying Chinese-made bikes, the same principle applies. Now, people take different positions on Chinese bikes. The critics, the dyed-in-the-wool critics, and it's like a terrible human rights record in China and an oppressive dictatorial regime. Yeah, tick, tick, correct. Chinese bikes are rubbish, don't last 2 minutes, cheaply built, no residual value whatsoever, look rubbish, yada yada yada. Right, well, most of that no longer true. And I think the position with Chinese bikes now, in the year 2024, is that they've had sufficient time to evolve and to become refined, and to nurture relationships with European manufacturers like KTM and BMW, and they've followed very much the same path that Japanese motorcycles did in the late 60s and early 70s, and starting to acquire a justly deserved reputation, not only for reliability but to good build quality and above all affordability. So just like back then in the 60s and 70s, if you wanted good hi-fi gear, good camera gear, or a decent usable car, you had to put whatever moral positions you had on the respective countries of manufacture to one side. Otherwise, hey, you'd have to do without. So that's just a little bit of perspective, because I know whenever I review a Chinese bike, and of course that last review that I did was of the CF Moto 650 NK, you sort of know what my views are, and that's very much my position. That back then, as a kid, I was getting great pleasure and great satisfaction from the fact that my parents were just about able to afford some quality camera gear, and my dad got great pleasure and great satisfaction from being able to afford some good hi-fi equipment so he could listen to his beloved jazz. Just as back then, now there are many people out there who will be able to appreciate and enjoy a kind and standard of motorcycle which they would only otherwise be able to dream of, courtesy of the fact that such machines are being offered from the Chinese manufacturing base. So that's my position. It's not a lecture by any means, it's a reflection upon, what's that French expression? Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stop as they are, basically, roughly translated. And that's absolutely the case currently. Certainly with Chinese bikes, and to a certain extent with these here Indian made Royal Enfields and BSAs. And I accept that India is a democracy and China isn't, but then India is a country of hugely polarised wealth and a tiny minority of very rich people and a whole host of people working their skin to the bone in sweatshops. Aye. So just have a think about that. I only mention it because I get so many comments from people who take a position on it, and they're quite entitled to take that position. I do understand it, but please understand why people like me and others are able to rank pragmatism over and above passion, if you like. That's the best way I can put it. Speak to you in a bit.